Marocchinate, the darkest moment of World War II. There are few things that have been true for nearly all human history since the first human settlements. One of them is that rape is possible in war or peace. The second problem is that most of the assaults go unreported, although happily, this is finally starting to change in a lot of the world. This is true of both female and male victims, who must suffer the same damage, but very differently in most cases. Today, we will tell you the gruesome story, the Marocchinate, or the deeds of the Moroccans. Those deeds were rape and murder on a large scale, primarily rape. What might also be less familiar to people is that the Moroccans were part of the Allied forces moving up the Italian peninsula in 1944. Hundreds of thousands of allies were inching their way up the Italian peninsula to Rome in the spring of 1944. The Allies invaded the Italian mainland from newly occupied Sicily across the Straits of Messina in September 1943. In the distant south of the nation, it was British and British Imperial troops doing most of the fighting. At Salerno, 140 miles south of Rome, it was American troops that landed in the north. To trap German soldiers between the north and south and have them surrender was the plan. Another part of the plan was the capture of Rome, which was one of the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis capitals, an enemy the Allies had been battling since 1939. The king and politicians close to him covertly reached out to the Allies shortly after the Allied invasion of their nation. They would depose and jail Mussolini and negotiate for peace in the hopes of saving their nation the devastation they knew would ensue. That is exactly what did happen. Mussolini was relocated to a distant mountain resort, and King Victor Emmanuel III and his chief counselor, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, formed a new government. To their dismay, Hitler had other plans, and his armies reacted much more rapidly to the news of the fall of Mussolini than the Allies. The Germans had already 5 to 8 divisions in southern Italy, maybe 50,000 men. In a matter of days, they added more than 250,000 more, pulling some desperately needed troops off the Eastern Front to counter the Allied threat closer to home. In addition, Hitler directed the well-known commando rescue of Mussolini from his captors. For years, the Italians had been a German ally, and although there was no love lost between them in 1944, by and large the Germans in Italy had conducted themselves well. Not after Mussolini's fall. From the 15th to the 26th of September, the troops of the Echos Division, who disobeyed German orders to surrender, battled German troops in an almost fortnight-long fight, which was only interrupted when the Italians were out of ammunition, surrendered, and were systematically killed by German army troops. 5,155 of the soldiers were killed. 3,000 of the remaining survivors were boarded on transport ships to be employed as slaves in occupied Europe, and most of the ships were destroyed by Allied pilots who were unaware of what was being transported on the unmarked vessels. Another 1,300 soldiers were killed in battle. German troops avenged the death of 33 of their troops in March of 1944, when they murdered over 300 people, many of whom were political prisoners or Jews. In late September and early October of 1944, the Germans killed over 700 civilians, 100 of whom were children, in Marzabotto town at Satana di Stacima. In August 1944 in Tuscany, Waffen-SS combatants and Italian fascist paramilitary killed over 500 people, 130 children, the youngest not yet 2 years of age. There were innumerable other lesser atrocities throughout the nation. It is for this reason that despite the destruction of war all around them, most Italians welcomed the arrival of the Allies to their towns and villages. They believed the worst was over with them, but had no idea what the future held for them. Despite the massive numbers of American and British Canadian forces in the country, the Italian campaign was an authentic Allied campaign. Polish, New Zealand, South African, Indian, Brazilian, and Greek soldiers fought in Italy, more than 100,000 men of the Free French Army among them. The French army had a large contingent of North African soldiers. Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were French colonies before World War II. Large groups of French sub-Saharan colonial troops from Gabon, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo-Brazzaville, and southern Cameroon were also present. France and Britain had declared war against Germany on September 3, 1939, and there were approximately 75,000 African military personnel in France. Most of the men of the French uniform remained at home for police duties, freeing French military personnel in these nations to fight for the motherland. After the defeat of the French, most of France's North African colonies were occupied by the Germans and the Italians. But by May 1943, the Germans had been forced out of Africa by the Allies' Operation Torch invasion of North Africa on the 8th of November, 1942, and at the same time, simultaneous British attacks from Egypt. While the Allies were liberating North Africa, the Free French troops combined the North African troops for additional training and recruited many more into the military. Approximately 75,000 North African men came to Italy either in the first landings or shortly thereafter. The majority of them were trained men who were integrated into formal army units commanded by the French, but a large minority were not. History recalls these men as the Goumiers. They were Moroccans, Tunisians, and Algerians, countries now considered Arab. They speak dialects of Arabic, write Arabic, and are mostly Muslim. But among the North African fighters, a disproportionate percentage were Berbers. The Berbers are the indigenous people of Northwest Africa, having occupied it longer than the Arabs who arrived mid and late 7th and early 8th centuries with the new religion of Islam. To be Berber today, or at least so recognized by the government, is difficult because of urbanization and assimilation in these countries. Berber practices, customs, and language differ from region to region. However, it is estimated that half or over half of modern Morocco, 15 to 40% of Algeria, and about 10% of the population of Tunisia are Berber. Most of the Berbers are Muslim, though there are Berber Christians and a few Berber Jews. The culture also includes ancient practices that are similar to the belief structures of tribal populations anywhere in the globe. Additionally, there is a long history of military, or perhaps martial tradition. For centuries, the Berbers have defeated, outlasted, or resisted countless invaders from the Carthaginians, who were Phoenician people and Romans forward. Most Berber tribes lived away from the coasts, in the hills, mountains, and deserts island. Survival in North Africa is difficult. Add to that almost relentless warfare or clan feuds, and you have one tough people. They were also a wild people with a reputation as hard, nearly fearless fighters whose weapon of choice was a blade, sometimes their traditional Goumier curved dagger. Berber troops excelled in the mountains and at penetrating seemingly impenetrable enemy positions, leaving slit throats and worse in their wake. German sentries who stood night watch in sectors where there were known to be Berber troops were either hyper-alert, tremendously frightened, or dead. Glimpse of slit throats and beheadings for the morning watch was enough to produce near panic and demoralization, especially among rearguard troops. Berbers and others were among the uniformed Free French forces. They were commanded by significantly more French officers per unit than the irregular Berber soldiers, known as Goumiers, and tended to be better behaved overall. The Goumier is named after the term Qoom, which was also from two Arabic dialects, tribe or people. French Goumier was a tribe member and was employed since the Berbers were enrolled in the French military in the early 1900s. A Qoom or Goum was the same size as the American military company, consisting of 200 or 300 men. A Goumier was a member of a Goum. Consequently, one tabor contained 3 or 4 Goums, a Turkish term retained during the period of Ottoman rule, the size of a battalion. 3 tabors constituted an engine of a group, French terms. A tabor was typically a relatively independent unit, i.e., it was not common for more than a tabor to operate together. Rather, they were usually dispersed to different sectors for the front lines, and even when concentrated, were usually based in Italy's mountain regions, where radio reception was at best poor. Late in the brutality-fought Battle of Monte Cassino, the Goumiers played a key role in pinning down German flanks in the mountains, keeping troops there too busy to reinforce where they were more critically needed, and for leading other French and Allied troops through the mountainous terrain, especially at night. The Goums and the whole French Expeditionary Corps were under the command of French General Alphonse Juin, who had commanded Moroccan troops before World War I, and who was better briefed on the Berbers and Goumiers than any European, also knew that part of their martial tradition was the capture of war booty. It had to be said of sexual assault and victory, whether it was a foreign foe or another clan. Juin is quoted as telling the Goumiers of the 1st, 3rd, and 4th tabors that for 50 hours, you will be the absolute masters of what you will find beyond the enemy. Nobody will punish you for what you will do. No one is ever going to ask you what you are going to do. While there is no indication that Juin ever uttered these words, it is generally thought that if Juin did not repay the Goumiers for what they had done after the crucial role they played in opening the road to Rome, the Goums would either mutiny or revolt, and Juin and the other French commanders could not afford that, at least at a time when the command of the Free French was still uncertain. Rome is in the region known to the Romans as Latium, the land of the Latins. It was called Lazio today, and even in World War II. The majority of the GUM units that were engaged in the region had their headquarters south of the city, mostly in the hills, where villages are sometimes close to each other as the crow flies, but hours away on foot, horse, wagon, and even jeeps. Radio contact village to village was also spotty, and that would further isolate the victims from what was to come. That is, even the handful of Goumiers or their French officers who may have tried to report the atrocities we're about to describe to you couldn't. Beginning on May 19, 1944, the day following the German surrender at Monte Cassino, and lasting for most of a week, the Goumiers in southern Lazio ran wild. Through the southern sector of the region, Goumier units, sometimes supplemented by regular units of North African soldiers of the French army, raged through little towns and villages in search of women, girls, boys, and occasionally men. Most of the men who remained in the villages were old. Most of them, and any young men that were discovered, were murdered, had their throats slit, and worse. It was usually done openly, and usually in front of their families. One of the men who tried to stop the attack on the people of his town was Don Alberto Torelli of Santa Maria di Esperia. Don Alberto had brought some women to his church for protection, but he was discovered and raped in the town square for hours. His wounds, both the beatings he had received and the rape, caused his death a few days later. In another town, Father Enrico Giannoni was killed while attempting to stop a mass attack on local women and girls. The atrocities are countless. Most, if not all, individuals were victimized more than once. Older women and mothers and young girls were raped, in some cases by groups numbering 200 or more. Some of the girls and women were murdered in the process. Some of them ended up committing suicide. Most of the women and men killed in the Marocchinate were infected with venereal disease that the goons had picked up in other towns, either in a legally established brothel or by rape. Goumiers raped en masse prior to and subsequent to the Marocchinate. They raped en masse in northern Italy, and they raped en masse in Germany. After the Normandy invasion, and subsequently in southern France, Goumiers committed acts of sexual abuse in France proper, but to a much smaller degree. The worst, however, were the rapes in the Lazio region, insofar as numbers are involved. There were a number of trials and hearings after the war on the Marocchinate. You're going to be hearing from a post-war Italian government committee. Although years have gone by, we are not substituting names, although they are on public record. We will be substituting initials for them. This is just a fragment of the record. It's estimated that well over 3,000 rapes took place during the Marocchinate in Lazio, likely far more, for many victims were killed or understandably refused to talk about their horrific experiences. Yar, about 50 years old, is slaughtered by Moroccans because she tried to defend her two daughters, respectively 17 and 18 years old. Daughters are raped and the mother is murdered. 55 years old, attempted to save her daughter Maria, 21 years old. She was shot 5 times in the stomach. LM was killed on May 26, 1944 in the Lozano district in an attempt to protect the honor of his wife LA and his 4 daughters. The trial of one young woman ended when the Canadian troops came to her town, forcing the goons to run away. The goons would have killed us. Valentina's daughter, they killed her. She was 17. She was very beautiful, and she was raped by 40 soldiers. When her mother stood up to them, they cut out her tongue and made her watch. In 2015, one woman, who was 15 when the goons came and escaped assault by hiding, testified thus. Not all of us were as lucky as me. I don't know how many girls were apprehended, but when the soldiers departed, many of them had venereal diseases. Some got pregnant. Fiancés spurned their fiancés. There were even young women who went crazy and committed suicide. Nobody really talked about it. It stayed in the family. The victims went to the doctor secretly, and the girls were given plans to abort. It was an awful time. It was as if they had killed the joy of youth. Everyone was sad, depressed. The British officer of the family also reported his findings. In the Patricia, Pofi, Isolita, Supino, and Morallo villages, all the females have been recently violated. In Lenola, which was taken over by the Allies on May 21st, 50 women were raped. But since these were not sufficient to go around, children and even old men were violated. It is said to be common that 2 Moroccan men violate a woman simultaneously, with one of them having normal sexual activity while the other has sodomy. In most cases, serious damage to the genitals, rectum, and uterus had been inflicted. In Kastrodvorsky, 300 rape victims were treated by doctors, and at Sicano, the British had had to construct a guarded camp to safeguard the Italian women. 9 months after the Marocchinate, in just the town of Veroli, more than 400 babies had been given to the town orphanage. No one has any idea how many babies were created as a result of this horror, but countless women in a heavily Catholic nation where the term abortion was hardly ever even uttered had their pregnancies terminated. Some through dangerous operations, some through combinations of herbs dating back as far as ancient Rome. Dozens probably died from faulty operations or infection from operations performed in barns, basements, and the woods. Most of them were infected by the goons, and they in turn infected their husbands. There was a huge outbreak of venereal disease. Most of the women in the slums were not ever cured. For the comparatively unharmed, the psychological and emotional trauma of rape endured a lifetime, influencing marriages and relationships. Some were infertile following the sex acts of the Marocchinate. Similar to the comfort women coerced by the Japanese to provide sex to their soldiers in the Pacific Wars, many victims could not be around groups of men, never got married, and remained childless. You hear or read of the Marocchinate. One persistent risk is the inaction of the French officers who were supposedly in charge of the goons. Paris Tomaso, in his book on what happened during the Marocchinate, states, French officers did not react to any call for help from the victims and stood by impassively at the actions of their men. As the testimonies tell, when the civilians arrived to report the violence, the officers shrugged and sent them away with a smirk. Does that mean that the French military did nothing? No, but they could have done much better. 28 goons were apprehended in the act and shot. 3 were later executed by firing squad following a court-martial. 207 were detained. 168 were incarcerated. In 1947, the French government acknowledged the behavior of their troops and compensation was negotiated. Except, naturally, the French failed to pay. The Italian government, as a payment for having invaded southern France in 1940 and being Hitler's ally, in fact paid what the French should have paid. Those reparations payments were minimal. For years to come, the French government and French citizens liked to duck their heads in the sand and pretend the Marocchinate did not exist. In 1960, though, a lot of French citizens, some who were just children when World War II ended, knew that Italian sensation Sophia Loren received the Best Actress Oscar for her part as protective mother in Two Women, La Sciacuria in Italian. It wasn't until the past 10 years or so that there had been discussion in France about what occurred and what the French government could do for the remaining survivors.